Cel shading is achieved by using flat colors for highlights and shadows instead of blended tones. Here's an example of flat colors. The flats lack depth. This is often used in TV production, storytime animations, comedy animation, or when budgets are limited. Flats aren't inherently bad, they just lack depth. Another style of using flat colors is called lineless animation, where you only see the shapes of color without the line art. Here's the flats shaded with smooth tones. This is known as soft shading due to the soft look. Soft shading gives depth by blending the tones, but is best reserved for background art, as it's very time consuming and difficult to keep the gradations of tone consistent frame by frame. And here's an example of cel shading. Unlike soft shading, cel shading uses solid blocks of color to suggest light and dark shades. Cel shading is drawn with a sharp line that separates the layers of colors into their own distinct forms. Cel shading is much faster than soft shading. For this reason, cel shading is ideal for 2D animation, as it gives depth to flat colors while working with the frame-by-frame workload of animation. Of course, adding more complex cel shading will increase the amount of time it takes to animate, since cel shading is another element that has to be drawn frame by frame. There's also Toon Shading, which is a digital effect that calculates where highlights and shadows will go. This type of computer-generated cel shade effect is more like what you'd see in a video game, such as The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. For now, we're focusing on the drawn cel shading style pioneered by traditionally animated films that used paints on celluloid. Cel shading typically uses 3 variations of a main color: the base color or mid color, a lighter version of the base color for the highlight, a darker version of the base color for the shadow. This type of simplified, flat shading is done by stacking the highlight and shadow layers on top of the base color layer. Here's some cel shading tips. Draw smooth shapes. You want to avoid jagged lines for cel shading and focus on clean shapes to get a crisp and readable image. Always think about the 3D shape and surface of the object. The planes that make up the forms will determine the shape of your cel shading. The light source is very important. Determine where the light source is and line up the highlights and shadows accordingly. You also have to consider the intensity of light. How strong the light source is will influence how vivid the cel shading is. How intense the highlights and shadows are also depends on how reflective the surface is. For objects that are less reflective, the highlights and shadows will be closer to the base color for a more subtle look. Highlights that are white and shadows that are black suggest a metallic or more plastic surface. When cel shading a human character, you might only need to shade shadows. Shadow is enough to suggest dimensionality in flat colors. Too many highlights will make the character appear slimy, so for a human, maybe the only highlights you'd need would be in the eyes, since eyes are wet, and some highlights on the hair, since hair is reflective. Skin is pretty reflective too, but be careful with how you handle highlights on skin, since too much will make the character appear oily or soaked in water. You can keep the highlights on skin very close to the base color for a more subtle effect. In certain cases, you may want to use more than just one highlight and one shadow. You can create a more bright highlight within a highlight, and add an even darker shadow within the main shadow. You build more depth by layering these tones, but be careful with adding too many levels of highlights and shadows. Creating more and more gradations in tone is best reserved for background art rather than animation. You can also play around with the opacity of your cel shaded layers to achieve the look you want. Less opacity will make the cel shading more subtle as the base color blends in with the highlights and shadows. All the layers are set to normal in these demonstrations, but you can also experiment with layer settings in your program, such as multiply, overlay, screen, and more to achieve different effects. Keep the base color or mid-tones fairly desaturated compared to the highlights. Try to avoid using base colors that are too saturated, or you could cause eye fatigue in the viewer. Think about the color temperature. This depends on the context, but in general, shadows are cooler and highlights are warmer. When animating, think about how the form's movement will change how the light appears. Experiment with different lighting angles. Light from below looks quite sinister. Cel shading is the most effective way to give flat cartoons more 3D form while maintaining the classic 2D aesthetic. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like and share it if you did, and subscribe for more.